The river took its time with everything in the territory, taking, carrying, and finally releasing. In the late autumn of 1881, it had chewed a new channel through the low bank outside Sagebrush Crossing. The water ran high from a stubborn week of rain, turning the mud slick as fat and the stones into silent teeth. The Apache Woman moved along that edge like she was listening with her feet. Delphine Waking Ash kept her weight low and her pace steady, stopping whenever the wind shifted. Rain had blown through her earlier, and smoke had clung to her hair before the day was even half done. She smelled of wet wool, old fear, and something metallic that did not belong to the water. She was not walking alone in the way people expected. She had the river's counsel, the reeds hiding her from the road, and the sky's changing light to break the shapes of men. Still, she knew what followed her. The town's laughter, and then its silence. The sheriff's boots on packed earth. The jingle of a chain that sounded too satisfied with itself. Sagebrush Crossing was not big. It was a strip of dust and boards around a wide street where the storefront signs swung on nails and the saloon doors opened and closed like eyelids. The town drew people who wanted the frontier to be simple, men who thought hunger, distance, and law were all the same thing. Delphine had learned otherwise. 2 nights earlier, a rope had tightened around her wrists until her palms burned. A ledger lay on a table somewhere nearby, full of numbers dressed up as morality. Men had talked about her as if she were a horse traded for a better price. When she had refused, they had called her ungrateful, and then treated her refusal as evidence. They had told her the river would calm her, the cold would make her docile, and the chains would keep her in line. But chains were not the only thing that could break. She had waited until the sheriff's men were drunk enough to slur their own names, and distracted enough to forget the one rule that mattered on a hard road. Don't leave a locked door unattended near a woman who knows how to survive. In the thin darkness of a shed, Delphine had felt the rhythm of the guards' breathing, listened to the river's voice through cracks in the boards, and measured the time by her heartbeat. When the moment came, she did not fight them with fury. Fury cost too much. Instead, she used patience like a tool, working small motions until the metal compromised itself. The chain link gave with a sound like a bone snapping. She had not escaped by running. She had escaped by becoming quieter than the night. Now the dawn was still only halfway awake. Delphine stepped into ankle-deep water, wincing when it struck raw spots on her skin. She found a place where the reeds thickened and the current slowed, then pressed herself into cover as if she could fold her body into the river's own language. She had a destination, but not a map. In the territory, maps were for people who expected to be protected by straight lines. Delphine carried direction inside memory, where the cottonwoods leaned, where a bend hit a ford, where the wind tasted faintly of sage and iron. She did not know if she would reach it. Her legs were heavy. Her head swam with the aftermath of pain and sleeplessness. Every step she took felt like borrowing from tomorrow. Then she heard horses. Not 1 or 2, more than that. The sound of leather tack and annoyed hoofbeats carried over the wet ground, and the men behind it sounded careless the way men did when they believed the world was already theirs. Delphine froze, her breath caught like a hook. She pulled her blanket wrap tighter, pressing her body into the reeds. Water beaded on her cheekbones and ran down toward her jaw. Her eyes stayed open even when they wanted to close. A voice called out, sharp with authority. Not the voice of a friend, and not even the voice of a decent stranger. It had that undertone of ownership, the kind that turned a human being into a possession. "Where'd she get off to?" the voice demanded. Delphine held still as the river kept talking around her. The men passed along the road above the bank. She heard boots slogging, heard a chain hauled in impatient hands, heard the dull clink of a badge or a buckle as someone shifted their coat. A second voice muttered something under his breath, then another laughed. It was the kind of laughter that came when you thought you were safe. Delphine's fingers curled in the wet reeds. She wanted to be invisible, not because she feared the men in the moment, but because she feared what their capture would do to her. She had survived before, She could survive again.
The thought that kept her from falling into hopelessness was simpler.
Survival was a responsibility, not a gift. The horses moved on. The road's noise dulled until it became a distant rumor. Then a different sound came, hooves, but slow. Not the scrape and hurry of pursuit, something careful, like someone listening for a reason to turn their body. Delphine peeked through the reeds. A man rode alone at first, a tall figure in a worn coat, hat pulled low, horse damp with rain. He was not racing. He was not calling. He seemed to weigh the air and choose his next step by what it might hide. Delphine's heart tightened anyway. Men could be danger even when they looked like help. The cowboy, Elias Grady, rode to the edge of the road and dismounted where the ground softened. He walked near the bank, not toward the center but along the contour of the land, like he knew the river could hide traps in plain sight. His eyes moved slowly, searching. He did not stare at the water like he expected a miracle. He watched the reeds, the mud, the bent grass, small clues a careless man would ignore. When he stepped closer, Delphine realized he might be looking for her. The certainty did not arrive with romance. It arrived like a cold blade. She shifted deeper into cover, pulling her body smaller. Elias Grady crouched and reached down near a muddy patch where a chain had scraped earlier. His fingers hovered, then touched something in the silt. He looked up once, scanning. Delphine thought she would be spotted. She braced for the worst and tried to gather herself into a shape that could withstand being touched by unfamiliar hands. Instead, Elias Grady looked away. Not in ignorance, in restraint. He rose slowly, as if he were afraid that sudden movement might spook an animal that had already been cornered. He took a few steps along the bank, then paused. His gaze settled on a spot where the current had tugged at her abandoned blanket wrap, the edge visible between reeds. Elias Grady reached for the blanket with the careful movement of someone approaching a skittish horse. He did not grab at the reeds. He offered the blanket to the air like it was a promise. Delphine's chest rose with a shaky breath. She could not tell what he meant to do until she saw his hands, open, palms visible, no gun drawn. "You ain't meant to be out here alone," he said, quiet enough that the river would have drowned it if it wished. Delphine did not answer. Her throat was raw. Her tongue had learned caution in places where words were bait. Elias Grady waited. He let silence settle, a respectful space between them. When he spoke again, his voice carried less certainty. "I'm Elias," he said. "I'm headed to town. If you can walk, I can get you there. If you can't, we'll figure it out." The way he said "we" made Delphine wary in a different way. Men claimed partnership when it served them. Elias sounded like he was offering shared burden, the kind that hurt. Delphine's legs finally failed her, not fully, but enough to make her feel the cold creeping up her bones. She pushed herself forward, dragging her blanket wrap around her like a shield, and stepped into the shallows. Water lapped at her calves. The pain in her wrists sparked when she tried to move her arms too quickly. Elias Grady saw her. He went still the way you went still when a buck crossed your trail and you realized you needed to decide whether you were friend or threat. Delphine lifted her face. Her eyes met his, dark and steady, and Elias Grady's expression tightened, not with desire, but with recognition of suffering. His mouth opened once as if he might argue with the situation, then he shut it. "Easy," he said. "Easy, darlin'." She flinched at the word darlin', not because it was harsh, but because it was tender enough to be dangerous. Tenderness could become a trap. Elias took a half-step closer. "You're hurt." Delphine let out a breath that sounded like a laugh without humor. "Help," she managed, the word breaking around the edges. Her accent carried old mountain syllables, not the quick, common speech of town. Elias Grady nodded as if he understood more than she said. He offered his coat. It was a rough garment, wool softened by use, with rain darkening the seams. Delphine hesitated. Elias did not force it. He turned his back slightly and held the coat out behind him, giving her the dignity of choosing whether she accepted. Delphine slipped her shoulders under the coat. Wool smelled of tobacco smoke and leather polish. It wrapped warmth around her and made the cold feel less like punishment. Then Elias lifted her carefully, supporting her weight at the ribs and under her knees. Delphine's body protested, sending sharp messages through muscles that wanted to shut down and protect themselves. Elias shifted his stance on the slick bank, adjusting his grip with grim patience. He did not speak while he carried her. He let her feel the fact of being held without turning it into a performance. When he set her onto the saddle in front of him, Delphine realized she was being mounted in a way that required trust, not convenience. Elias tightened the blanket around her as if he were bundling provisions for winter, practical, thorough, and not pretending she weighed less than she did. "You'll shake in the cold," he said. "I'll ride slow." Delphine kept her arms close. She wanted to ask why. Why him? Why now? Why not ride past the way other men did when trouble crawled out of the weeds? But questions were dangerous. Sometimes questions invited answers that made you more vulnerable. As they rode, Sagebrush Crossing grew closer. Smoke from chimneys smeared the morning sky with a gray bruise. Wagon ruts cut the street, and puddles reflected crooked buildings like broken mirrors. The town moved with the sluggish energy of people who expected the day to get worse. Elias guided his horse toward the quieter side of the town, away from the saloon's front windows. Delphine watched shutters open and close. She watched men look at the way Elias rode, the way he kept her hidden from careless eyes. Some faces turned away at first. Then, as whispers traveled, the faces returned with sharper curiosity. The corrupt sheriff, Marshal Rourke Pell, sat high in his office under the painted sign that promised law. His reputation preceded him. People feared him the way you feared a storm you could not predict. Delphine had already heard about him before. Everyone had. He did not simply enforce the law, he fed on it. He could make a charge appear from thin air, and he could make a jail key seem like mercy. Elias did not hide that he knew Marshal Pell's kind. As they neared the sheriff's grounds, Elias pulled his horse to a stop near a side alley. He did not head straight for shelter. He looked toward the jailhouse first, then toward a small porch with a water pump. "Stay low," he said to Delphine. Delphine swallowed. Her stomach clenched at the word low. It was the same advice women got when trouble came with guns. "What do you want?" Elias asked, softening his voice to something more human. Delphine's answer came slowly. "Not jail." Elias nodded once, tight. "Then we don't go to town where he can grab you." Delphine wanted to laugh again, not because it was funny, because it was impossible. Marshal Pell controlled the town's roads with the authority he'd stitched from lies. "You can't hide from him," she said in a quiet, certain tone. Elias's eyes stayed on the street. "I can't," he agreed, "but I can make it harder than he wants." He guided her toward the porch where an elderly woman might live, someone whose kindness had survived long enough to remain stubborn. As they walked, Delphine kept her head down. Her wrists ached every time she moved her arms, reminding her that escape did not mean healing. From inside a window, a man's voice rose. "Who's that?" The door creaked open. A rough-faced ranch hand stepped out with a lantern. He blinked at the pair and then narrowed his eyes at the way Elias carried the situation. "Elias Grady," the ranch hand called, using a name like a warning. "Sheriff wants her back. You got no business." "Business?" Elias cut in, not loud but firm enough that the air seemed to tighten. "You got a tongue you keep for chewing or for telling the truth?" The ranch hand's expression flickered. He looked behind Elias like he expected authority to come running. Elias's hand rested near his holster, not drawing, just letting the threat be understood without wasted motion. Delphine saw how the man swallowed. She saw how the lantern's light shook. "You ain't got a claim," the ranch hand said finally. Delphine felt a coldness in her chest. Claims. Always claims. Men argued over land titles and cattle brands, and they argued over women the same way, only the paper was blood. Elias turned his head slightly toward Delphine. "You own anything?" he asked. Delphine stared at him. The question was not what she expected. She waited for the catch. "The deed is with my father's people," she answered. It is under a different name now. Elias's jaw clenched. Then they're stealing more than you. The ranch hand spat into the dirt. Marshal Pell'll drag it out of her. He'll make it clean. Elias's gaze hardened. No, he said. He'll make it dirty. There's a difference. The ranch hand hesitated, then stepped backward as if he'd been given a hard shove without touching. His lantern swung with a thin rattle. Elias guided Delphine into the shaded space near the porch and pulled his coat tighter around her shoulders. He did not pretend it was safe. He pretended it was temporary. Drink water, Elias said. Slow. Delphine reached for the cup, her fingers trembling. Water tasted like iron and rain. When she set the cup down, she realized Elias was watching the street again. A shadow moved across the road. A wagon creaked, wheels carving the wet ruts. A group of men walked beside it, boots muddy, faces hard with purpose. In the wagon's bed, something metallic clinked, chains perhaps, or tools. Then Marshal Rourke Pell arrived on horseback, the way a man arrived when he believed the town existed to witness his authority. His coat looked too clean for rain and too dark for honest daylight. His badge gleamed like it had been polished with entitlement. Delphine's skin tightened at the sight of him. Marshal Pell's eyes traveled over Elias first, then landed on Delphine like a measurement. There she is, Marshal Pell said, voice carrying to the porch. The ranch hand looked relieved, as if the sheriff's presence made his own fear justified. Elias did not move quickly. He stayed where he was, blocking a direct line between Marshal Pell and Delphine without raising his fists. Marshal Pell dismounted with slow confidence and stepped forward. He smiled as if he were about to make a deal. Ma'am, he said to Delphine, the word dripping with false politeness. You've been found. Delphine remained still. Her eyes did not dart. She could feel the heat of Elias standing close enough to share warmth, close enough to be a shield. Marshal Pell glanced at Elias. You, Elias Grady, I thought you had sense. Elias's voice stayed even. I have more sense than you. Marshal Pell laughed once, short. That's a fine joke. His gaze returned to Delphine. She's property in this jurisdiction, Elias. Belongs to the ledger. Belongs to order. Delphine's fingers tightened on the coat edge. Elias took a step closer to Marshal Pell, just enough to be heard without forcing. She ain't property, he said. Not in any place a decent man's heart can reach. Marshal Pell's smile faded by degrees. Decent men don't interfere when the sheriff's making things right. He pointed a gloved hand toward Delphine's wrists. You can help her by handing her over. Delphine almost expected Elias to comply. Not because she thought Elias wanted to, but because the territory trained men to survive by surrendering to the loudest authority. Elias surprised her. He reached up and removed his hat, holding it in both hands like he was stripping himself of excuses. His calmness was the most dangerous part. She's coming with me, Elias said. If you want to arrest someone, arrest me, or don't pretend your badge makes you holy. Marshal Pell's eyes narrowed. You'd risk your life for an Apache woman? Delphine flinched at the word Apache, the way some people flinched at a slap. Not because it was wrong, because it was being used like a muzzle. Elias did not look away. I'd risk it for anyone who's been chained and told it's for their own good. The porch fell quiet. Even the raindrops seemed to pause. Marshal Pell's expression turned thoughtful, as if he were calculating how much trouble Elias would be worth. He glanced toward the wagon behind him, toward the men waiting in wet silence. Then Marshal Pell spoke again, softer, more personal. You don't know what you're saving her from. Delphine held his gaze. I know what I've been saved from already, she said. Marshal Pell's smile returned, thin as wire. And yet you're still alive. That should tell you the river ain't the worst thing. A chill moved through Delphine. The way he talked about survival made it sound like it belonged to him. Elias's hand brushed his holster. He did not draw. Take him, Marshal Pell ordered the men behind him. Elias moved faster than Delphine expected, not with violence first, but with motion that broke the pattern. He shoved Delphine back behind the porch post, forcing her into cover, and then stepped out into the open street. The first man advanced with a club. Elias pivoted and knocked it aside, using the wet ground like a weapon, slipping just enough to make the attacker misjudge his footing. Delphine heard the struggle in the air, the thud of boots and the crack of leather against wood. Her breath came fast. She wanted to help. Her wrists made it impossible. Every attempt to stand straight made pain spike. Elias fought like a man saving time. He did not aim to win a brawl. He aimed to create an opening. When it came, he grabbed Delphine under the arm and pulled her into a side alley, away from the porch and toward a back lot where a half-built stable stood. He shoved her behind a stack of crates. "Stay here," he said. Delphine stared at him. The phrase sounded like a command disguised as kindness. "What about you?" she asked. Elias's eyes flicked to hers. "I'll buy you minutes." Marshal Pell's men chased, boots splashing. A gunshot cracked somewhere down the street, sharp and ugly. Delphine flinched, then forced herself not to move. She pressed her palms against the crate wood until it stopped trembling. Through a gap in the boards, she watched Elias Grady run into view. He did not shoot. He sprinted toward the sheriff's wagon, grabbed the reins, and yanked the horse around like he knew the animal's habits. A second gunshot followed. Delphine held her breath. She saw Elias stagger just slightly. Not enough to fall, but enough to tell her pain had reached him. He kept going. He drove the horse toward the river road, dragging the wagon's chaos behind him. Men yelled and lunged for controls that were already shifting away from their command. Marshal Pell appeared in the street, furious now, his authority exposed as fragile. He shouted orders, calling for pursuit. Delphine used the distraction. She crawled out from behind the crates, moving on her knees to avoid sudden motion that would announce her. The ground was muddy, leaving a trail that felt like blood. She reached the alley mouth and slipped along the wall toward the river path where the reeds grew thick. Elias had started this rescue, but she understood the truth in the territory. Salvation was shared labor. It was never one man alone. Delphine moved by sound. Horses neighed in the distance. Men cursed. The town's noise churned like a storm. Then she heard Elias's voice, closer than she expected. "Delphine!" he called, and the use of her name startled her. She hadn't told him her full name. He could not have known. Her heart stuttered. She turned toward the riverbank. Elias Grady appeared between wet brush and hanging branches, his coat torn, his hat skewed, blood darkening the cuff of his left sleeve. His face looked drawn, but his eyes held steady. "How'd you—" she began. Elias shook his head. "Later." He pulled a small object from his pocket and held it out. A torn strip of cloth, stiff with mud and old dye. He touched it gently, then pointed with his finger toward the river path. "Your blanket," he said. "I found it by the scrape. I know your people's pattern. I've been around." Delphine swallowed hard. Her throat tightened with a grief she hadn't planned to feel. He did not just rescue her with muscle. He rescued her with attention. "Come on," Elias said. Delphine's legs shook as she stood. She tried to step forward and nearly fell. Elias caught her elbow, careful now to avoid her raw wrists. His touch was firm, but his voice softened. "Don't fight pain," he told her. "Let it pass through you." Delphine drew a shuddering breath and forced her body into forward motion. They walked toward the river's curve where the ford made a shallow path. Water glittered like broken coins in the gray light. Behind them, the town's shouts grew louder. Elias pushed her toward the water. "We go now, before they see us clear." Delphine hesitated at the thought of running again. Running meant being chased. Running meant the same fear, only with different names. But her fear did not win. She stepped into the river. Cold struck her like a slap. She gasped and then kept moving, dragging her feet against the current's pull. Elias waited beside her, guiding her hand across stones, placing his body between her and the deeper current. His strength was not showy. It was practical. and exhausted. They crossed into a stand of willows where the reeds hid them. Men's voices echoed, searching for a trail. Delphine crouched, blanket wrap soaked now, hair plastered to her neck. Her wrists burned. The air tasted like wet dirt and smoke. Elias sat on a fallen log and pressed his sleeve against his wounded arm to slow the bleeding. Delphine stared at him. "You're hurt." "I'm fine," Elias said, but his voice betrayed him. He swallowed once. Delphine reached for his sleeve and then stopped, remembering his earlier restraint, how he refused to grab. She asked with her eyes. Elias nodded slightly. Delphine pulled the sleeve away. A shallow wound sat under the fabric, raw and angry. Blood had soaked the cloth. Delphine tore strips from her own wrap and used them as bandages, fingers steady despite the tremor of adrenaline. Elias watched her work. His gaze softened, and that softness scared her more than the sheriff's chains had. "What's your father's people's name?" Elias asked. Delphine hesitated, then spoke. "Waking Ash." Elias repeated it once, carefully, like a man learning to speak a truth instead of stealing it. "Waking Ash." His breath caught faintly. "I didn't think They didn't want me sold," Delphine finished for him. "But they couldn't stop a man with a badge and a hungry ink pen." Elias's jaw tightened. "Then you're not here to hide. You're here to claim what's been taken." Delphine looked away, toward the river's churn and the reeds that hid their tracks. "I used to think I wanted quiet," she admitted. "Quiet life. A cabin. Maybe a man who didn't ask too much." Elias's eyes flicked to hers. "You thought you wanted that?" Delphine nodded once. "I thought if I chose peace, the world would respect it." The confession tasted bitter. Quiet had been the lie the territory offered to make women accept their loss. Elias leaned back, staring into the gray sky. "The world don't respect peace. It respects strength." Delphine turned her head slowly. "And what strength is that?" Elias looked back at her, his voice lowered. "Strength that don't pretend to be clean. Strength that shows up when everyone else rides past." Delphine felt something inside her shift, not into love. Love was too big, too risky, but into trust. Trust was smaller and more dangerous. Trust could get you killed. The search parties passed the willow stand without finding them. Their boots thudded near the bank. A man's voice cursed about the tracks disappearing. Delphine and Elias stayed still as the world breathed around them. When the voices finally faded, Delphine exhaled and realized her lungs hurt. Elias stood first. He helped her up, and together they found a narrower path through brush that led away from the town toward the high ground. Sagebrush crossing receded behind them. The sky lightened by degrees. Somewhere far off, a train whistle moaned like a distant animal. After an hour, Delphine's body began to fail her again. Exhaustion turned her limbs heavy. She leaned against a scrubby pine and closed her eyes for only a moment. When she opened them, she saw Elias looking at the ground with a grim expression. "What is it?" she asked. Elias reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. It was wet at the edges, creased and stained with river mud. He held it out carefully. Delphine took the paper and unfolded it. Her breath caught. It was a land title copy, an imperfect transcription, likely stolen from an office clerk's desk. The name on it was not her own. It was a name she recognized anyway. Marshall Rourke Pell had filed it. He had registered the deed under a substitute identity, the kind of bureaucratic lie that turned stolen land into legal theft. Elias had taken the copy while causing chaos in the sheriff's wagon. Delphine stared until her eyes blurred. "He was going to make me disappear twice," she whispered. Elias nodded. "He figured you couldn't fight a paper." Delphine's hands tightened on the document. "He didn't know I could read enough." Elias's expression softened. "Then we'll make him choke on that paper." Delphine looked up at him. "You're angry." "I'm not a saint," Elias said. "I'm just tired of watching men use law like a club." Delphine shifted her wrap and tucked the document into her belt pouch where it would be close to her heartbeat. "Why help?" she asked again. She needed the answer to settle in her bones. Elias looked away toward the open plain. Wind moved the sagebrush like quiet hands. "Because I rode into towns like yours once," he said. "Not Apache, not native, but poor and hungry. And I watched a sheriff take a man's ranch for debts he never owed." Delphine listened, every word carving a new place inside her understanding. Elias continued, voice rougher now. "I made it out, but I promised myself I'd turn back when I saw the same look on someone else's face." Delphine held the silence like a fragile thing. Her upbringing had taught her that promises were either weapons or vows. Elias's sounded like a vow. "And you keep it," she said. Elias nodded. "I try." They traveled that day and the next, moving away from wagon tracks and out of sight whenever they heard distant riders. Delphine learned Elias's pattern quickly. He listened first. He moved second. He watched hands and eyes like they were weather signs. By nightfall of the second day, they found an abandoned cabin on the edge of the flats. Its roof had collapsed in one corner, but the fireplace still held stones. The door hung crooked. Wind pushed through cracks, but it didn't freeze the place in the way open land could. Elias checked the area like a habit. He scanned for tracks, for smoke, for strangers. Delphine stood inside the doorway and rubbed her arms, trying to warm the blood slowly returning to her hands. Elias found a bag of dried beans inside a cupboard, turned black with age but still usable. He gathered wood and built a small fire. The flame caught with a stubborn hiss, then settled into an orange glow that made shadows behave. Delphine watched him work. She had seen men cook before. She had seen men fight and men brag. But Elias worked like every action was a careful step over broken glass. He set a pot near the fire, then looked back at her. "You eat," he said. Delphine hesitated. Taking help felt like borrowing, and borrowing felt like future debt. Elias did not pressure. He simply sat across from her, keeping space and letting her decide when hunger outweighed pride. Delphine ate slowly, forcing herself to chew through pain. The beans tasted like smoke and dust. Still, the warmth in her belly was something she did not want to waste. Afterward, Elias stretched his wounded arm out and winced when he adjusted the bandage. Delphine rose and took the cloth again, tightening it carefully. Elias watched her. "You don't have to." "I want to," Delphine said, and surprised herself with how much want was inside the words. Elias's eyes deepened. He seemed to understand the danger of it. He did not rush. He did not try to own the moment. Instead, he spoke about the town's law and how it had turned ugly. He talked about how Marshal Pell bought silence from drunkards and threatened sober men with the threat of false charges. He described how the sheriff's paper trail would become a wall unless Delphine met it with something stronger than hatred. Delphine listened and then spoke a truth that made her throat tighten. "Marshal Pell didn't just steal my land," she said. "He stole my father's promise." Elias frowned. "Your father promised what?" Delphine hesitated, then lifted her chin. "He promised me I would never have to trade my life for his favor." The confession hung in the air. Elias's face hardened with sympathy that looked like rage held in check. Delphine continued. "They told me quiet would make the sheriff forget. They told me if I stayed grateful, the law would leave me be." Her voice broke. She forced it steady again. "But quiet just teaches a wolf where to bite." Elias stared into the fire until the flames licked the edges of his thoughts. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "Then we don't do quiet," he said. "We do truth, and we do witnesses." Delphine blinked slowly. "Witnesses don't matter when the sheriff decides." Elias looked up. "Witnesses matter when someone with a badge stops being the only voice." The idea was dangerous. It suggested a kind of war fought with law instead of guns. It also suggested a chance for Delphine to reclaim herself. Delphine sat back against the cabin wall. "Who would listen?" she asked. Elias's mouth tightened. "Anyone who's tired enough of Pell's lies." Over the next week, Elias and Delphine moved cautiously, gathering people who had seen Marshal Pell's hand slip into the ledger. They found a blacksmith who had paid for a wagon repair with a bribe disguised as a fine. They found a ranch widow whose husband's debts had been forged after he protested a land seizure. They found a schoolteacher's ledger book, its pages smeared where ink had run from a threat. Delphine spoke carefully, choosing which details to offer and which to keep behind her teeth. Elias stayed near, acting less like a rescuer and more like a partner, making introductions and keeping men from treating Delphine like a curiosity. The more they gathered, the more Delphine felt a new kind of fear. Not the fear of capture, the fear of hope. Hope made you plan. Hope made you imagine a future. Hope made you vulnerable to disappointment. Yet she could not stop herself. One night the wind blew cold and the cabin's roof creaked as if it were old bones complaining. Elias sat by the fire with a stack of papers tied with twine. Delphine watched him while her eyelids grew heavy. When she finally slept, she dreamed of chains, not the kind made of iron, but the kind made of words, promises that tightened until they stole breath. When she woke, Elias was gone. Panic surged through her like a thrown stone. She grabbed her pouch and stumbled outside the cabin, scanning the dark. Then she heard a voice, Elias's voice, behind the trees. "Now don't you panic," Elias said gently to someone. Delphine followed the sound, stepping over rocks. She found Elias standing near a small campfire a distance away, his wounded arm wrapped tighter. Beside him stood a tall figure in a worn uniform coat. Not Marshal Pell, a deputy, or maybe something else. Elias turned toward Delphine, relief flaring through his eyes. "I went to talk to the marshal of the next county," he said. "Not Pell, the other one. The one who ain't on Pell's payroll." Delphine's mouth went dry. "You left me?" Elias shook his head quickly. "I didn't leave you. I left you safer than if I stayed." The uniformed man stepped forward and addressed Delphine with a cautious respect. "Evening," he said. "I'm Marshal Tamsin Crow." Delphine had heard of Crow. His name carried the kind of honesty people rarely believed in. Crow studied Delphine's face, then her wrapped wrists. "You're the one Marshal Pell's been dragging around?" Delphine didn't answer at first. She felt like her pride was a shield, and the shield was cracked. Elias spoke for her, voice steady. "She's the one he tried to claim as property. She ain't." Crow nodded slowly. "Then we'll see who the land belongs to, and who the law belongs to." Delphine's throat tightened. "You can't just come in here and—" Crow lifted a hand. "We can try." He looked at Elias. "And we can protect the witness." Delphine exhaled a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Still, the territory never softened without demanding payment. When Crow came to Sagebrush Crossing days later with warrants and a small group of men who carried real authority, the town buzzed with fear. People pretended they didn't care while caring so hard their teeth clicked. Marshal Pell arrived in town square in a storm of outrage. He wore confidence like armor. He stood in front of his office and watched as papers were laid on a table. He laughed. "My jurisdiction," Pell insisted. Crow's voice stayed calm. "Your jurisdiction ends where your fraud begins." Delphine stood at a distance, hidden partly by Elias's shoulder but visible enough that her presence mattered. Her hands still ached. She could feel the memory of chains like a second set of nerves. Pell's eyes found her. His smile thinned. "You," he said, "you think you can come back with a new man's papers and turn the world on its head?" Delphine stepped forward despite Elias's slight tightening grip. Elias gave her a look that said, "Stay steady." She did. Delphine lifted her belt pouch and pulled out a copy of the deed transcription she had carried from the reeds. She unfolded it and held it up. Pell's expression changed by a single degree, so subtle most people would miss it. Delphine did not miss it. She had learned to read micro-expressions the way some people read weather. Pell's jaw flexed. Crow's men asked for Delphine's testimony. Delphine spoke of chains, of threats, of bribes that had been disguised as fines. She spoke of the ledger that measured human bodies like cattle. Pell tried to interrupt. He raised his voice and his men moved like trained dogs. Elias stepped in at the right moment. Not to fight, not with fists, but with the proof he had taken. He handed over the cloth strip with the pattern that matched Delphine's family blanket. It tied her story to evidence Pell could not erase. Then came the twist that Delphine had not fully understood until the sheriff's hands began to shake. The deed transcription Pell had used contained more than a false name. Hidden in the ledger's margin, in ink that had been scraped and rewritten, was a mark, an official stamp that indicated the land had been settled years earlier through an agreement Delphine's people had never consented to. Crow held the document up and squinted, his brow furrowed.
That stamp, Crow said, voice turning serious,
Isn't from our county at all. Pell's smile collapsed into something ugly. Delphine felt the realization arrive like a punch to the gut. Pell had not merely stolen her land, he had been laundering a larger scheme, selling Apache property across jurisdictions under forged settlement records to bring wealth into his own pockets and into the hands of men higher up than any of them wanted to name. In other words, Pell's power was not just local cruelty, it was a pipeline. Pell stood at the edge of being exposed, and his reaction was what made the truth unavoidable. He did not plead, he did not bargain. He attacked with lies that grew louder and more frantic. The crowd heard it. A ranch widow flinched at Pell's cruelty. The blacksmith's face hardened. The schoolteacher stepped forward with her smeared ledger book. And Delphine did something that surprised even herself. She did not just speak like a victim, she spoke like a claimant. She named the land. She described boundaries in the language of memory and stones. She described an old marker the settlers had tried to move. She told where the river's curve swallowed the last survey post. Pell could not counter memory with his forged ink. Crow's men arrested Pell as the town watched in stunned silence. Some cheered. Some looked away so they wouldn't have to admit they'd believed him. Delphine felt shaky as if the ground under her had shifted. Elias stayed close, steady as a post in the wind. As they walked away from the jailhouse, Delphine asked the question that burned inside her. "Did you come to help me?" she said. "Or did you come to stop a man like him?" Elias's eyes flicked to her face. His expression was honest, no romance mask in place. "I came to help you first," he said. Delphine inhaled, then exhaled slowly. "And after?" Elias looked toward the open street where the sun had begun to break through clouds. Dust hung in the air like gold dust, waiting for a hand. "After," he said, voice softer, "I realized you weren't asking for quiet. You were asking for dignity." Delphine's heart tightened, and she fought the old instinct to retreat. She fought the instinct to keep love out because love could be used against you. Instead, she let the feeling exist without grabbing it. "What do you want?" she asked. Elias's gaze held hers. "I want you safe," he said. "I want you choosing your own life, not because a sheriff said you could." Delphine swallowed. "Choosing costs." Elias nodded. "I know." They walked toward a small room in the widow's house where Delphine could rest. The town smelled of wet wood and fresh straw, and the sky looked brighter than it had any right to. But Delphine did not relax. She knew this was only the first step of a longer road. Then Marshal Crow came by, brief and practical. He handed Delphine a document stamped with legitimacy. Her land, her people's land, was being recognized again, and the ledger's forged name was being voided. Delphine's hands trembled as she accepted it. Crow's eyes softened for a moment. "The legal fight isn't finished," he warned, "but it starts here. You won't be alone." Delphine nodded. When Crow left, Elias sat on a chair near the door, keeping watch. He looked tired now, not just in body but in spirit, like he had carried too much danger for too many days and was only now allowing it to show. Delphine approached him carefully. She did not place her hands on him. She let her presence be known. Elias looked up. "You hungry?" Delphine shook her head. "Not for food." Elias's brows lifted slightly. Delphine's voice was quiet, but it held a truth she could no longer put away. "When you rode into the river, you didn't ask me to forgive you for saving me." Elias blinked. I never asked for forgiveness. Delphine stepped closer. Her bandaged wrists still hurt, but the pain didn't stop her from reaching. She placed her palm on his chest, feeling the steady rhythm underneath his shirt. "You didn't treat me like a prize," she said. "You treated me like you were trying not to break something already broken." Elias's throat worked. He looked away for a moment as if he were afraid of the emotion catching fire. Then he looked back at her and held her gaze. "I can't fix what happened," he said. "I don't need fixed," Delphine replied. "I need chosen." Elias stood slowly. His hands hovered near her shoulders, unsure if he had permission. His caution was the opposite of manipulation. It was respect. Delphine nodded once. Elias pulled her into a careful embrace. His arms wrapped around her like he was building shelter out of living effort. Delphine pressed her face against his shoulder, letting herself breathe in the scent of rain, leather, and stubborn humanity. Outside, the town stirred. Life returned in rough ways. Shutters banging, voices calling, horses stamping as if they needed reminders that the world still moved. Inside, Delphine held on to the warmth that wasn't stolen by force. She realized the twist was not only that Marshal Pell's corruption ran deeper than anyone had expected. The twist was that her fear of quiet had been wrong. Quiet wasn't the enemy. The enemy was silence imposed. Elias helped her break the silence. Now, in a small frontier room, Delphine allowed her body to soften around a new kind of vow. One made without chains, without ledger lies, without threats. Elias kissed her forehead, gentle enough that it felt like a promise not yet tested by winter. Delphine closed her eyes and listened to his breathing. When she opened them again, she faced the future with a wary calm. She would fight paperwork if paperwork lied. She would choose her own home. She would not disappear into quiet. And Elias would stay. Not because the sheriff told him to, not because the town expected a romance to follow a script. He stayed because he'd promised himself, and because Delphine finally believed that love could be more than rescue. It could be partnership. In the hard beauty of the frontier, under dust and sun, their story began again, this time with dignity at the center, and with the law finally forced to look at the truth it had tried to bury.